You'll have to forgive me. I had a bit of a late night last night, so I'm finishing off some stuff for friends. Um, Best friend's birthday's today, so we gotta get all breakfast and stuff ready for him. But let's move on. So yesterday I did the whole recording, and I think my mic is working now. I did the whole recording without the mic working, so we're going to repeat the same subject we did yesterday. We're just going to run through it again. And what you can see everything cool. And what the subject for today is it's thresholds. You might know this word, but I know before studying architecture I had no idea what this was. And the typical definition of it is basically the barrier, the entrance step between inside and outside. And so you see it's basically this element here. All of that is the threshold, or this specifically is the threshold, this wooden plank that you put on top. It's the transition space between inside and outside. You call it a door threshold, so this is called a door threshold. And a windowsill is also another type of threshold. And what it is, its definition of it is actually, it's the point of entry or the beginning. And the typical example of it is a strip of wood or a stone forming the bottom of the doorway, as I've described. And if you put a bunch of thresholds together, you get a procession. Sorry, my girlfriend just walked in. You get a procession. And if you imagine a door threshold, I'm just going to I'll draw perspective here. So you've got your door threshold, your step, and then your door. It kind of rises up over it. This front element is the threshold, but there's no saying that it has to be as wide as a step, for instance. We could lengthen it. We could put another step if we wanted to. We could put a awning on top. We could put some water, a water feature maybe. We could add some more columns that lead to this awning. We could put some timber slats on the side if we wanted to filter light, maybe create some privacy. All of these are part of the threshold. And so you can see that there's lots to play with actually. There's quite a lot that you can add and engage with to create the threshold. Now, thresholds have been around for ages. Oh, sorry, not this one first. Sorry, it's this one. Now, thresholds exist in nature. If you imagine walking through this tunnel here, creates a threshold. If you wanted to, you could put a building on the back of it to create that threshold. And the threshold doesn't just start at this point here, but actually it starts where this building comes down, where this roof overhang starts. Because I'm just going to draw a section of this. If you take a line, say that's your ground, and you have your rock formation that does something like that, and you stand down there, as soon as you walk underneath it, you've crossed a line. an imaginary line, but it's there. And as this moves down further, you are moving further and further into this kind of threshold space until you reach the culmination of that threshold, which is at its lowest point in this instance. And then it goes back up. And then the threshold recedes. So it goes up. And so what you're doing now is you're doing a slow transition to a threshold as you're moving through it, and then a slow regression of the threshold as you move out of it. So it's not just necessarily a flat thing. It can progress and get more defined as time progresses. As you move forward, you can add elements to it, beams that run over, whatever, and then you can have it regress, or you can have it keep growing, and maybe it becomes the space. And the space is the element behind it. It's the room that you're entering, the lounge or the bedroom or whatever it may be. So that's natural thresholds that exist already. And if they incorporate it into ancient man-made structures, you'll see that concept pervades. Again, we've created this kind of arrival space before you enter into the actual room. So all of this is the threshold. And you might say, okay, fine, it is your entrance portal or your portico, or whatever kind of other language you might want to use to describe it. And yes, that is absolutely correct, but they're all effectively thresholds. And you'll see there's stronger thresholds and weaker thresholds. For instance, here, this is a step in the ground. That is a threshold. You walk over it, you step over it. And then there's another one. And so they together create this idea of moving into this more private space. And the fact that you're moving around this big element over here creates another kind of threshold. It's because you're moving around, it's something you can't see. So anything that you're playing with your eye, essentially, your senses actually create that sense of thresholds. And the fact that they've used stone here defines this element as a different threshold. If they'd used the same material throughout, it would be one continuous threshold. You wouldn't feel that it is these series of thresholds, these processions running through. And I know they've added a staircase here, but the staircase is also a threshold. And that leads me to the next point, which is that a threshold doesn't have to necessarily be horizontal. It can be vertical. So, for example, what I've shown you so far is a staircase, is are thresholds running in line, in series of each other. But they can also go up. So if you take a staircase up to a level above, this staircase is a threshold. But they can also run in parallel. So for example, if you've got a staircase on the one side, and you've got an awning that comes along that, this is one threshold, this is another threshold. They're different thresholds that run next to each other, and they can mean different things. Now you ask yourself, why do we have these thresholds? What is the point of them? And I'll expand a bit more before I run into where they exist and how deep they go, and different types that you get. So why thresholds? Well, the thing is that they're transition spaces between spaces, right? They define, so if this is let's say this is your bedroom, and this is your lounge. This space in between, it creates a kind of barrier, a feeling that you're moving from a public space to a private space. And if you were to go from the bedroom to another bedroom, well, you probably would have a corridor that runs alongside that. I'm drawing a plan here in case you don't know. A plan is a top-down view. And let's say, so you move from the lounge, you move through this corridor, and that leads you to the different bedrooms. And then you'll have, at the end, you'll have the master bedroom. Now, I'm touching on another subject, which is called public to private. And the concept, essentially, is that you go from the most public to the most private, and then through a series of steps to get to this most private space. And each of these steps is defined by a threshold. So for example, if you enter into the house, that is the first threshold. You enter into this space. And then you move through into the corridor. That is your second threshold. And because it's a corridor, it's a very long threshold. And when you enter into the bedroom through a door, that is your third threshold. And obviously the final threshold is the most private, is the master suite or main bedroom. Now it doesn't have to be this way. I've seen a lot of houses where the main bedroom is at the front door. I don't know why it's like that. It's very strange, because if you think about it, you've got a postman or a delivery coming to your door, and he has direct access or very close direct access to your main bedroom. So that's why length of time or length of threshold is important. So the length of the threshold between your entrance and your most private master suite is very long. So I was just checking this chat there. And the longer it is, the more private this becomes. All right. Let's move forward. So here we've got a series of thresholds that go into procession. This is an ancient Egyptian temple. And what you'll see here is that you've got these series of lines that are running through, and they created these spaces in between them. There's the arrival space. You move up a series of stairs. They are stairs, they're not it's not a ramp, so this is not wheelchair friendly. And okay, Mel, hi. So good morning. It's good to see you. Yeah, so if you want to blend them, obviously you'll weaken the threshold. So for example, if you there's a lot of buildings that we design in the bush let's quickly let's see if I can quickly draw the perspective here for you. So you've got your bed, for instance. This is quite a common design parameter that we work around. And you're lying in your bed, and you want to look out into the bush, right? So there's trees and there's animals. And what you'll do then is you'll create a very big opening so that your field of view generally doesn't read it, and then you'll make this basically all glass. And that way you won't actually read it as a barrier between inside and outside. Another way of doing it is by creating a continuous floor finish. So for example, the inside floor finish and the outside floor finish is consistent. So for example, let's say this is a deck or timber slats or timber flooring, and then you do the same floor finish on the inside, on the outside. So that's the second way you can do it. Another way is to actually minimize the step. So if you have your bed sitting over here, and your guy chilling there, then this step is very important to get right. And the problem is also that it has to deal with weather. So you'll have doors or whatever it may be, and if you can get this level change to be as small as possible. So normally what we do is we try and get it to about, the minimum you can get it to is about 50 mils. But if you make this a deck, which means water can run through it, you can make it pretty much flush. You can bring it down to about 20 mils. And so when you're walking out, you don't feel that, oh, I'm going out of the building. You're just smoothly sliding out of it. Another thing you can do is about the opening of this building, this opening. So for example, if this is very hard to open, you're strengthening and forcing that threshold. But if you make it very easy to open, you're allowing that threshold to disappear. So in the kind of buildings that we design, we always do sliding doors. That's because you can turn a key and open it. Whereas if you have, for example, folding stacking doors, where the doors, you have to undo the one and you have to move it across to the side. That's a very slow opening process. So the threshold gets reinforced. So there's an element of time that is attached to this idea of threshold. which I mentioned earlier. Like the longer you make it, and the length can be physical, so the actual distance between where I'm going and where I'm starting, but it can also be just temporals, like how long it takes me to get to where I want to go. If you made a threshold out of mud or concrete, maybe like a very thick slurry that you have to walk through, it's a very long and defined threshold and hard threshold. Hope that answers your question. Tell me if I haven't been clear enough. Just going back to this. Okay, well, you're quiet. I assume we're good. So what's this happening here? This is cool. So this is again just these different spaces, and what they're leading to is this temple that you can see. There's a little doorway at the end there, and that doorway is essentially the final threshold into the space. And all of this actually is geared towards that space, that specific entry point. And so what they'll do is, because this is a temple, it's very important that you you go through the necessary cleansing of your mind and spirit to enter into the building. At least in this kind of setup, it is that. So this is, these kind of courtyards, these plazas that are next to a walkway, which then takes you through another kind of space, a threshold space, which you then through, and then you go downstairs, which then leads you to the public space. And I can tell you now that from there, there'll be more things that you're going through to get to them. And if you draw that in section, what you end up getting is a series of, tell me if you can see that. Cool. So you've got your temple on the one side with its doorway, and then from there you've got a covered walkway, which is with a series of columns. That's one of the elements is called a procession. So you've got your columns that run through that, and then you've got a level change in the height of the roof. So normally the lower a building is, the stronger the lower the threshold is, the more enforced and defined it is. The higher it is, the less you feel it. So what they've done is there's an open air threshold, so you don't feel that so much, which goes into a taller threshold. So it's a slow progression, the threshold that's happening here. Let's just get rid of that. So then from there you've got a slight open promenade on the front, and then from there it takes you down the ramp. So you can see, if you look at the section, what's happening is that the threshold is going from open air, very big and undefined. As it moves up, it becomes smaller, and then it goes into a very small threshold. And the reason this is very small is for dramatic effect. So what's happening now is that it's enhancing, it's making you feel diminutive and small, so that when you enter into the temple, it becomes a much larger, much more emphasized space. And when you enter the temple, I can tell you now that it's from here, it's not just a straight, big, voluminous environment. You'll go through a series of more narrowing and smalling spaces, and then from there open up into the big hall. And at the end of that big hall will be some kind of focal visual element that then ties your eye. So you can see how we're creating a story. It's a narrative that we're creating, where the climax is this final element that you're creating, and the beginning of it is the actual entrance where you arrive. And by doing this, you're enhancing and emphasizing this kind of element at the end. And the longer you make this, the more this is emphasized. And the big thing is that there's a relationship between the volume, the emphasis that you're trying to create, and the element that you're emphasizing. If, for example, you go through all of these crazy hoops and there's almost nothing at the end, or there's nothing at the end, it's like reading a book that has no climax. Or watching a movie that has no ending, a real ending. You want to feel satisfied, and that all of this is basically building a climax. So what we're doing at the moment is we're creating a narrative that, if you've read books, you'll know that, or the theories of books, you'll understand that stories happen in these kinds of these mini climaxes, and each mini climax will build up to a higher point. So the first climax might be, the boy and the girl meet. The second climax is that the girl actually starts dating someone else. Now the guy's depressed. So, and what happens is there's a drop in the stress level, or the desire of the audience to find out what happens, and then it builds up again, and then it drops, and then it builds up again. And so what this building is doing is exactly the same thing. it starts off building you up, literally, and then you've arrived at this space. So that's that first climax. Then it drops down as you enter through the threshold, then builds up again as you're moving through the threshold. Then it reaches the top when you get to this element here, and then it goes back down again. And it keeps doing that until ultimately the final climax is where the end of the building is. That's when you're physically prepared, you're spiritually prepared, you're completely prepared for that ultimate experience. And that's why it's so important that thresholds are really, like, you understand thresholds, because they're such an important tool to master our arts. Just more examples of different types of thresholds that you get. These are again all Egyptian. And what's interesting is that it's not just limited to a doorway, for instance, as we've got here. There's a temporal nature to this threshold by the sense that there's a light source that's shining on this doorway. And maybe it is that this doorway only gets used when this light is shining on that door. We've got some uplighting happening here, but that's obviously after the fact. That's for display kind of events. And also, like I mentioned earlier, is the floor finish. So here we could see this is sand, excuse me. And if, for example, this is stone, that link between the different materials will emphasize and enhance this threshold. And if you also look here, they've created this architrave around this building, around this opening, that also emphasizes this idea of the threshold. Looking here, we've got the same thing. It's massive, very tall columns, and each of them define a threshold that we move through and ultimately reach an endpoint. Whether or not that is actually the endpoint, I'm pretty sure the actual main walkway is this way. Nonetheless, that is still a threshold that we're moving through. And thresholds, like I said earlier, can also be outdoors. So you've got staircases that you're moving over, you've got columns that you're moving around. And all of these are taking you through these different types of spaces. Even the fact that you're walking around this building and around to the back, that means that all of this is a threshold that you're moving through. And obviously within that, you've got smaller thresholds. You've got staircases that take you up into doorways and around on this side as well. And even going up, like you said here, there's an element out here where you're outside and you're moving through. Those are also thresholds. And we can also do that in bridges, for instance, as also a threshold. Staircases, waterways, all of these things are also thresholds. And within them, you can have multiple mini thresholds. For example, the staircase that we've got now is the staircase as the threshold moves up. Then you've got a landing element. Now maybe at this landing element, there's something to look at on the side, a visual component, or maybe something to experience. There's some, I don't know, whatever that is. So these staircases are creating this whole element that moves up. And again, this is gearing you up to this ultimate experience at the top there, this massive cave. Now, you'll ask yourself, why is this is like being replicated throughout history, number one, but also throughout different locations, different cultures? That's because this is an intrinsic human element that we've got. The way we actually love living is because we come from caves, and caves have this natural kind of threshold. You enter into it, and then from there might be little caves that come off it, and through that we define it. And then on the outside there's maybe there's a fireplace, and there's like a fire pit, and there's maybe a fence around it. So we're creating these barriers. Even from traditional times we've been doing this. It's, you look at ancient cultures, they all have these kinds of threshold elements. They can be very uniform, like this bridge, but it's very defined because of the fact it's a bridge, it's narrow, it's the only way you can go, but also very long. And they use it also in coffee shops. It's not just these hardcore ancient buildings or very prestigious buildings. It's everywhere. Like the fact that there's a material change from the inside to the outside. The fact that there's an awning creates this threshold space in front of the coffee shop. The reason that this is glass, allowing that visual link between inside and outside. Here's the same thing. It's basically these three buildings. You look at them, you go, oh, they're completely different. They work exactly the same way. They're doing exactly the same thing. They've all got this outside awning space, and that's to do with welcoming. So you want your guest or your clients or customer to feel welcome to the building. So you create a space for them that's not necessarily inside your building, but something that they can already start connecting with. That they can stand on the outside. So you're creating a social space on the outside that someone can sit here and drink their coffee. And now that you're creating a kind of pore space on the outside, it'll allow people and invite people to come into the inside. And you can see even here, there's a strong threshold with this concrete, but it's welcoming because there's a chair and a seat and an awning outside, so you're still protected, you still feel invited, you feel friendly, you feel engaged. Whereas if you look at, like fortresses, for instance, or that's something maybe I should look at as well, is this idea that, like if you have an elevation, that's just a blank elevation, and there's no entrance point, there's no doorway that kind of shows you, oh, this is where I need to go in. You're going to feel completely uninvited, completely separated, and not engaged, because it's not talking to you, it's not engaging you, it's not welcoming you. So I think the thing that's really interesting is that thresholds are everywhere, and you can experience them everywhere. So these are two very different buildings. We've got a Zaha Hadid building. Mel, you must just tell me if you've joined in when I'm repeating myself. You've got this ultra-modern building designed by, ultra-contemporary rather, designed by Zaha Hadid. She's passed away, unfortunately, so we'll no longer see any cool stuff from her. But what's amazing is that this building and this Notre Dame building, which is designed and built now, I think it's 800 BC, or AD, sorry. They've got the same kind of function. They both have this big public plaza in front of them that they engage with. They both are on the one side of that public plaza. They both have, this one a lot smaller, have these kind of threshold spaces that they're holding, openings that they hold and keep the space open. The Zaha Hadid building just has a much more impressive version of it. It kind of leans forward and out, and then it has this massive cantilevered structure on top. So its threshold space is much bigger. It's all of this elements, all of this here is its threshold that it creates. Now, this is a photo that I took when I was there, and although it's very impressive to see this building cantilever, I mean, it comes out at an insane angle. This bottom section is already angled, and then it has this thing on top that comes out, and even this top element angles. But the strange thing is, it's a public building, right? It's a school of economics. You don't need to know that, whatever. And there's this big public plaza in front of it. No single person hangs out in front of this building. No one is here. Because it's too imposing, it's too strong, it's too dominating. Whereas in this, in the plaza in front of the Notre Dame, there's always people. There's people performing. And you might say, oh, sure, because it's a tourist attraction. And maybe that is the reason. But, there's benches for people to sit on. There's not a single bench or anything in front of this building. And so its threshold space is very harsh and defined and dominating. Whereas this threshold space, even the fact that it's vertical, the Notre Dame is vertical. It's a facade. It's a clean, straight facade. Whereas this thing is overpowering you. It's coming at you. So it's a lot stronger, and it's not friendly. And so, in my opinion, as a building, from a public use point of view, this is not a very successful building. Whereas the Notre Dame, for instance, would be, because it has much more public space. And you'll say I'm talking about public space, and I'm interchanging it with thresholds. They're all, the subject matters all kind of mesh together. They're not, this is threshold, that's public space, this is entrance, that's threshold, whatever it is. They all, blend and blur to each other, and how you use them kind of define them. So I wanted to just quickly talk about public threshold spaces that you can experience or explore in your own, home, or where you are when you go around. And the perfect example I find that really defines a very strong threshold is the one between reality and fantasy. And the kind of threshold that you imagine when you see that, you go, okay, maybe it's a television. That transports you to another world. But you're not actually you're not actually moving your body or anything, but it is taking you to another world, and therefore it is a threshold. It's a link between two different worlds, two different spaces. Also, aeroplanes. Let's do the British spelling. They're transporting you from one location to another. That is a threshold. If you think of going to the cinema, don't know, maybe in other places of the world it's different, but here in South Africa, you've got the mall, generally it's a mall. And then you go through this long kind of winding road to be able to enter the theater. And then when you enter the theater, you generally enter it like in some small side entrance. And then from there, in the dark, generally, you'll walk down these stairs and then you'll find your seat. These rows of seats. And then you'll experience your movie screen or your movie, whatever you're watching. And this tunnel that you're going through, I'm exaggerating a bit here, but it's pretty close actually, considering, I mean, they could do it much more efficiently if they really wanted to, I feel. I haven't designed a shopping center or theater, so I wouldn't know. But I mean, there is necessity around it. But you know, the fact that it's padded with this, you know, noise-proof sound, all of these kinds of, the fact that it's diffuse lighting, it's dark lighting, it's a very long threshold that's transporting you from one world to another, from reality to fantasy. And because it's got this super long tunnel that you're going through, and you've kind of geared yourself, you've prepared yourself, you've gone through that physiological and mental transformation to go into this fantasy world, this experience will always beat this experience because of this threshold. This threshold and the fact that you go into this different world, and it feels like a different world. I mean, you know, it's quiet. There's surround sound that kind of focuses all your attention. You're wrapped into this kind of environment, and that's why it's so successful. So think of other examples of thresholds around the world that you engage with every day, and try and see if you can understand them and see what they're actually doing. And in that way, you'll become sensitized to what threshold is doing and what architects are doing, creating these kinds of spaces. And you know, we'll go further in the journey, and you'll see that the overlaps continues. You know, it's like I mentioned earlier, there's threshold, urban space, public space, all of those kinds of environments kind of overlap. But I look forward to taking it further and exploring further with you. And Mal, if you're still there, thank you very much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Very cool to have a sign of interest and support. And if there's anything you want me specifically to cover, you can just let me know. You can either on the chat now or also, I think on the Discord, I'll probably create a Discord for this. Well, I've got my own Discord, but maybe it's better if I just create one for the actual group. All right. Glad to be here. Awesome, man. That's really cool. Really appreciate it. And oh, awesome. Thank you. I appreciate that, man. That's really cool. All right, man. I assume. I don't know. We'll just go with person. And I hope you enjoyed it. And again, if there's anything you want me to cover, just let me know. I think for the next couple of episodes, it's going to be very basic, this kind of element. Oh, that's really cool, man. I'm really glad. So the moment like we're doing like threshold and public space, and we're going to do very basic type elements, and then we'll move further into buildings. So once we understand the basic principles of architecture, we'll move into analyzing buildings, actually designing. I mean, the first episode you saw was me designing, but I realized I was covering so many topics that I couldn't really explain in that format because there wasn't enough time, that I felt I needed to go through it again, like as a separate subject matter, and then come back to actually analyzing buildings. And maybe we'll do them at the same time, concurrently. All right, hopefully we'll see you tomorrow. Otherwise, have a good day and rock on. Goodbye.